Picture this. You're standing in a bustling Viking trading post in Hedeby, 950 AD, where the smell of tar, salt, and exotic spices mingles with the acrid smoke from blacksmith forges. A Frankish merchant's wife has just been dragged into the market square, her silk dress torn, her hands bound with the same rope used to secure cargo. Her crime? She diluted the honey her husband sold to Norse traders with water, thinking these barbarians wouldn't notice the difference. But she's about to learn that Vikings took trade deception as seriously as they took battle honor, and the punishment for a trader's wife who participated in cheating. That wasn't just death, it was a carefully orchestrated destruction that would serve as a warning to every merchant family from Dublin to Constantinople. The crowd gathering around her includes her own children, forced to watch what happens when you mistake Viking pragmatism for stupidity. Before we delve into these meticulously documented accounts of Viking justice that will shatter every romanticized notion you have about medieval trade, if you're fascinated by how commerce and violence intertwined in ways that shaped European history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that exposes the brutal realities behind historical trade routes. And please share in the comments where you're watching from. It's remarkable to think we're exploring these harsh truths together from locations that Viking longships might have once raided, where the economic systems they enforced through terror still echo in modern commerce. What you're about to discover isn't the sanitized Viking history of museums and television shows. These are the documented accounts of a culture that built the most extensive trade network of the medieval world, not through diplomacy alone, but through a reputation for methodical, economically motivated brutality that made cheating them a form of suicide. The Vikings didn't just punish trade deception, they transformed it into public spectacles that served as quality control for international commerce. When a trader's wife participated in cheating these Norse merchants, she wasn't just risking her life, she was challenging an entire system that maintained order through carefully calibrated terror. Let's establish a fundamental truth about Viking society that explains their extreme response to trade deception. These weren't mindless raiders who stumbled into commerce. The Vikings created the most sophisticated trading network of their era, stretching from Greenland to Baghdad, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. They standardized weights and measures across cultures, established protected trade routes, and developed credit systems that wouldn't be matched until the Italian Renaissance. But this system relied entirely on reputation and trust. In a world without courts or police, where a handshake sealed deals worth fortunes, cheating wasn't just theft, it was an attack on the entire structure that allowed long-distance trade to exist. The role of women in Viking trade operations was far more significant than most histories acknowledge. While men sailed the dangerous routes, their wives often managed the actual businesses. They negotiated prices, supervised storage, handled money changing, and maintained relationships with foreign merchants during the long months their husbands were at sea. A trader's wife wasn't a passive figure, but an active business partner whose integrity was essential to the family's commercial success. This made their participation in deception particularly egregious to Viking sensibilities. It represented a fundamental breach of the trust that made their economic system possible. The Vikings' approach to punishing trade deception by women reflected their complex views on gender and honor. Unlike many medieval societies that saw women as property, Vikings recognized female agency, which meant women could be held fully accountable for their actions. A wife who cheated Viking traders wasn't seen as a foolish woman who didn't know better, but as a calculating enemy who had chosen to wage economic warfare. The punishments they devised specifically targeted what Vikings saw as feminine vulnerabilities while serving as educational spectacles for other merchant families. The case of Estrid Silvertongue, documented in the Icelandic trade sagas, illustrates the typical progression of Viking justice. Estrid was the wife of a Frisian merchant who regularly traded walrus ivory with Norwegian Vikings. When her husband fell ill, she took over negotiations and began mixing inferior whalebone with the ivory, betting that her customers wouldn't notice until they were far at sea. But Vikings had generational knowledge of Arctic goods. When they discovered the deception upon reaching Iceland, they didn't simply demand compensation. They launched what they called a trade raid, specifically targeting Estrid for exemplary punishment. The concept of trade raiding represented a unique Viking innovation in commercial enforcement. Unlike normal raids focused on plunder, trade raids aimed to punish specific economic crimes while leaving the broader commercial infrastructure intact. Vikings would arrive at a port, bypass general pillaging opportunities, and focus entirely on the family that had cheated them. This surgical precision sent a clear message. Honest merchants had nothing to fear, but cheaters would face consequences worse than any normal raid. The specificity made Viking justice more terrifying than random violence. The documentation from Arab chroniclers like Ibn Fadlan provides disturbing details about what Vikings did to women who participated in trade deception. The punishments were designed not just to kill, but to destroy the woman's identity as a merchant, wife, and mother. They would begin by publicly stripping her of all trade goods and symbols of merchant status. Her merchant scales would be melted down in front of her. Her counting boards would be broken. Her seal rings would be cut from her fingers. This ceremonial destruction of commercial identity preceded physical punishment, emphasizing that her crime was economic rather than personal. The Viking practice of trade shaming involved forcing the guilty woman to confess her deception in increasingly humiliating ways. She would be made to stand in the market where she had cheated them and announce her crimes to every passing trader. But mere confession wasn't enough. She had to perform her deception, showing exactly how she had diluted goods, switched materials, or falsified weights. This educational aspect served dual purposes. It taught other traders Viking sophistication in detecting fraud while forcing the woman to relive her crime repeatedly. Some women were required to perform these demonstrations for days before final punishment, their voices growing hoarse from constant confession. The physical punishments that followed trade shaming were calibrated to match the specific type of deception. A woman who had diluted honey might have her mouth filled with a mixture of honey and salt water, forced to swallow the burning combination until she vomited blood. Those who had substituted inferior furs would be sewn into the rotting pelts they had tried to pass off as fresh, left to suffer as the decomposing skin attracted insects and disease. The Vikings called this wearing the lie, making the punishment a literal embodiment of the deception. These weren't random tortures, but carefully matched consequences that other traders would understand and remember. The economic destruction of the cheater's family went beyond simple confiscation of goods. Vikings practiced what they called trade line severing, ensuring that the family could never engage in commerce again. They would burn the family's warehouse, but leave their home standing, destroy their scales, but not their furniture, kill their draft animals, but spare their milk cows. This selective destruction eliminated commercial capability while leaving subsistence needs partially intact. The family would survive, but as beggars, living reminders of what happened to those who betrayed Viking trust. Children of destroyed merchant families often became slaves, specifically sold to honest traders as a form of compensatory justice. The involvement of Viking women in punishing female trade cheaters adds another dimension of gendered violence to these accounts. Norse women, particularly those married to prominent traders, often took the lead in designing and implementing punishments for female commercial criminals. They understood the intricacies of maintaining a trading household and felt personally insulted when other merchant wives violated the unwritten codes of commercial honor. The Saga of Thorin. Tradekeeper describes how she personally oversaw the punishment of a Byzantine merchant's wife who had been passing off lead weights, covered in silver as pure metal, thorns. Methods revealed sophisticated psychological torture. She forced the Byzantine woman to craft new lead weights while her fingers were systematically broken, one joint per false weight discovered. Between each breaking, the woman had to attempt to continue working, demonstrating the impossibility of maintaining craftsmanship while suffering the consequences of deception. The process took days, with careful medical attention ensuring the woman remained conscious throughout. Other merchant wives were forced to watch, learning through vicarious agony what awaited those who thought they could outsmart Viking traders. The sexual violence that accompanied trade punishments reflected Viking beliefs about honor, ownership, and commercial contamination. A woman who cheated in trade was seen as having polluted the sacred trust of commerce with feminine deception. The Vikings believed this pollution needed to be purged through violation that destroyed her status as a respectable merchant's wife. Gang rape by the cheated traders was common, but it was structured as commercial transaction rather than simple assault. The woman would be sold to each violated trader for the exact amount she had cheated them, turning her body into currency that paid back the debt through suffering. But the Vikings went beyond simple sexual violence. They developed what they called trade breeding, forcing women who had cheated them to bear children who would be raised as slaves specifically trained to detect commercial fraud. These children, products of rape, would be taught from infancy to identify diluted goods, false weights, and substituted materials. When they reached adulthood, they would be stationed at trading posts as inspectors, living reminders of their mother's crimes. The psychological torture of bearing and nursing children who represented your own destruction, then watching them raised to prevent others from committing your crime, created generational punishment that extended far beyond the original cheater's death. The documentation methods Vikings used to record trade punishments served both legal and educational purposes. They carved detailed accounts into wooden boards that would be displayed at trading posts, creating libraries of commercial crime and punishment. These fraud boards included names, crimes, punishments, and often anatomically explicit illustrations of the consequences. Merchants arriving at Viking ports would be required to view these boards before conducting business, signing with their mark that they understood the penalties for deception. The boards created a visual contract that transcended language. Barriers you couldn't claim. Ignorance, when the consequences were literally illustrated in front of you. The Baltic trading posts developed specialized architecture for conducting trade punishments. Archaeological evidence reveals platforms designed for public punishment, with drainage systems for blood, mounting points for restraints, and acoustic designs that amplified screams across the harbor. These weren't improvised scaffolds, but permanent infrastructure that showed how integral punishment was to Viking commercial operations. The investment in punishment architecture sent a clear message. This wasn't occasional, rough justice, but a systematic part of how Vikings maintained their trading empire. The role of children in witnessing their mother's punishment for trade crimes served multiple functions in Viking justice. Children were positioned according to age and gender, young boys at the front to learn what happened to those who violated commercial honor, girls to the sides to understand their future responsibilities as traders' wives. But most cruelly, children were often made to participate in minor ways, holding ropes, carrying implements, counting out the fraudulent goods. This participation created complicity that would haunt them into adulthood, ensuring they would never forget the consequences of commercial dishonesty. The Viking practice of compensation. Theater turned restitution into performance art. A woman who had cheated on grain quality might be force-fed the moldy grain she had, sold until her stomach ruptured. One who had watered wine would have wine poured into her lungs until she drowned in the liquid she had diluted. Those who had shaved coins would have slivers of metal inserted under their fingernails and skin, experiencing the physical incorporation of their fraud. Each punishment was designed to be both literally appropriate and visually memorable for the watching crowd of merchants. The network effects of Viking trade punishments extended far beyond individual ports, creating an international system of commercial terror that self-regulated through fear. When Vikings punished a Frankish merchant's wife in Hedeby, detailed accounts would spread along every trade route within months. Skalds, Norse poet historians, composed elaborate verses describing specific punishments, turning commercial justice into oral tradition that traveled faster than any formal news system. These weren't simple warnings, but intricate narratives that included the woman's name, her specific crime, the exact methods of punishment, and most importantly, the names of Vikings involved. This naming culture meant that a Norse trader arriving in Novgorod could invoke a punishment that had occurred in Dublin, and local merchants would know the reference and fear accordingly. The Arabic chronicler Ahmad ibn Rusta documented how Muslim traders developed elaborate authentication systems specifically to avoid triggering Viking retribution. They created sealed containers with multiple verification points, witness signatures at every transfer, and even early forms of insurance where multiple merchants would guarantee each other's goods. But when these systems failed and a Muslim merchant's wife was caught adulterating saffron with turmeric, the Vikings' response created diplomatic incidents that required intervention from the Abbasid Caliphate. The woman wasn't simply punished, she became the subject of a staged commercial trial where Viking legal procedures merged with trade protocols. The trade trial that Ibn Rusta witnessed involved the accused woman defending her saffron quality before a panel of Vikings who demonstrated encyclopedic knowledge of spice, cultivation, harvesting, and processing. They produced samples from across the known world, showing subtle differences in color, aroma, and texture that proved her deception beyond doubt. But the trial's purpose wasn't to establish guilt that was already determined. Instead, it was to educate every watching merchant about Viking expertise. The woman was forced to explain her adulteration techniques in detail, creating an inadvertent masterclass in fraud that actually taught Vikings new deception methods to watch for. The punishment phase incorporated elements of Islamic law in a perverted form, showing Viking awareness of cultural sensitivities they could exploit. The woman's head was shaved, a dishonor in Islamic culture, but the hair was then sold to wig makers with the proceeds going to the cheated Vikings. She was forced to wash the feet of the Viking traders she had cheated, inverting the Islamic hospitality customs. Most cruelly, she was made to call the Islamic call to prayer while describing her crimes, mixing sacred words with confession in ways that Muslim observers found spiritually agonizing. The Vikings understood that physical pain was temporary, but spiritual violation created lasting trauma. The involvement of Christian clergy in documenting Viking trade punishments created some of our most detailed historical records. Monks traveling with merchant caravans often served as scribes and witnesses, and their chronicles reveal the systematic nature of Viking commercial justice. The Chronicle of St. Gallen describes how Vikings operating from their base in Ireland developed standardized punishment protocols that were literally written in blood, using the victim's blood mixed with oak gall ink to create permanent records. These blood documents were considered legally binding across Viking territories, creating a macabre form of international commercial law. The economic ripple effects of harsh Viking trade justice actually stabilized medieval commerce in unexpected ways. Merchants who might have casually cheated each other thought twice when Vikings were involved in any part of the transaction chain. Insurance rates for goods traveling through Viking territories were actually lower than other routes because fraud was so rare. The Venetian merchant houses, despite their moral objections to Viking methods, preferentially hired Norse escorts for their caravans because the mere presence of Vikings discouraged deception from suppliers and buyers alike. The threat of extreme punishment created what economists would now recognize as a low-trust equilibrium maintained through credible threats. The seasonal patterns of Viking trade. Punishment revealed sophisticated planning that maximized both economic and psychological impact. Summer punishments coincided with peak trading season when the most merchants would witness them. Winter punishments were reserved for locals who had cheated Vikings during the previous trading season. Their suffering prolonged through the cold months as a reminder that Viking justice was patient but inevitable. Spring punishments often involved forcing the guilty to watch as honest traders received preferential treatment and prices, showing that integrity paid while deception cost everything. The technological innovations Vikings developed for trade punishments showed the same ingenuity they applied to shipbuilding and navigation. They created portable punishment devices that could be assembled at any trading post, collapsible frames that could display a person at optimal viewing angles, modular restraint systems that adjusted for different body sizes, even acoustic horns that amplified confessions across busy markets. These devices were decorated with carved scenes showing previous punishments, creating visual warnings that transcended language barriers. The craftsmanship was deliberately excellent, showing that Vikings put the same care into punishment tools as they did into trade goods. The psychological profiles of women who survived Viking trade. Punishments reveal long-term damage that extended far beyond physical scars. Frankish records describe survivors who could never again handle the goods they had adulterated. Women who had diluted wine would vomit at the smell of grapes. Those who had substituted furs would break into hysterical tears when touching animal pelts. This conditioned aversion wasn't accidental, but deliberately induced through Viking punishment methods that created lasting associations between specific goods and extreme suffering. Some women became inadvertent quality inspectors, their traumatic reactions serving as warnings when inferior goods were present. The integration of Viking trade punishments into local legal systems shows how effective terror can reshape jurisprudence. Many European ports began adopting modified versions of Viking commercial justice, creating hybrid systems that maintained the deterrent effect while reducing the physical extremity. The Hanseatic League's commercial code explicitly referenced Viking precedents, though they substituted financial destruction and social exile for bodily punishment. The philosophical principle that trade deception warranted extreme response became embedded in European commercial law, a Viking legacy that influenced business practices for centuries after longships stopped raiding. The transformation of Viking trade punishments into ritualized commercial ceremonies revealed how violence became embedded in medieval business culture. The market confession evolved from simple admission of guilt into elaborate performances, where the accused woman would reenact her entire deception from planning to execution. Vikings insisted these reenactments include every detail, showing where materials were hidden, demonstrating mixing techniques, even recreating conversations where they plotted to cheat Norse traders. The woman would perform her crime sometimes dozens of times as new merchants arrived at port, each performance slightly different as exhaustion and terror degraded her ability to maintain consistency. Vikings viewed these inconsistencies as evidence of additional deceptions, adding new punishments for each variation. The case of Adelheid of Mainz, preserved in Rhineland trading records, demonstrates the economic sophistication of Viking justice. Adelheid had developed an ingenious scheme involving gradual weight reduction in silver coins over multiple transactions, shaving amounts so small that individual trades seemed honest. But Vikings maintained meticulous records across trading seasons, and when they discovered the pattern, their response targeted not just Adelheid, but the entire economic network that had enabled her fraud. They traced every coin she had handled, demanding compensation from every merchant who had unknowingly passed on her debased currency. The financial forensics. Vikings performed predated modern accounting by centuries. Adelheid's punishment incorporated economic education that turned her execution into a teaching moment for 3 different trading communities. First, she was forced to create a complete set of fraudulent coins showing her progression from honest weight to maximum debasement, each piece marked with the date and victim of its use. Then she had to demonstrate her shaving techniques to assembled metalworkers, revealing trade secrets that had been passed through generations of dishonest merchants. Finally, she was made to calculate exactly how much silver she had stolen over 5 years of trading. The mathematics performed publicly while progressive punishments were applied for each season of theft discovered. The Viking innovation of bloodline contamination, as punishment for female trade criminals, reflected their understanding of hereditary reputation in medieval commerce. When a trader's wife was caught in deception, Vikings didn't just punish her, they marked her entire lineage as commercially untouchable. Daughters would have their faces branded with symbols indicating their mother's crime. Sons would be castrated to prevent them from continuing the family line. But most cruelly, pregnant women would have their crimes literally carved into their bellies, ensuring that children born after the punishment would bear scars from before birth. These marked children could never enter honest trade, creating a permanent underclass of commercially tainted individuals. The religious dimensions of Viking trade punishments evolved as they encountered different faiths across their network. They learned to weaponize each culture's specific spiritual fears. Christian women would be forced to perform their punishments on holy days, compounding physical suffering with spiritual anguish. Jewish merchant wives caught in deception would have their punishments designed to violate kosher laws in addition to causing pain. Muslim women faced punishments that deliberately broke ritual purity requirements. This religious targeting wasn't random cruelty, but calculated. Destruction of the spiritual frameworks that gave these women strength to endure physical suffering. The architectural evolution of Viking trading posts to accommodate public punishments created specialized urban landscapes of commercial terror. The great trading center of Burka included a designated fraud square, where punishments were conducted, surrounded by merchant stalls so business could continue while justice was dispensed. The square featured permanent installation points for various punishment devices, drainage systems for blood and waste, and elevated viewing platforms where visiting merchants could observe while negotiating deals. The juxtaposition of normal commerce with extreme violence created a unique psychological environment where the threat of punishment pervaded every transaction. The medical knowledge Vikings accumulated through systematic punishment of trade, criminals advanced their understanding of human anatomy in disturbing ways. They discovered precise pressure points that caused maximum pain without death, learned exactly how long different tortures could be sustained, and developed techniques for reviving unconscious victims to continue punishments. This knowledge was compiled into what Norse traders called justice guides, illustrated manuscripts showing optimal punishment methods for different crimes. These guides were traded among Viking communities like valuable commodities, creating a standardized approach to commercial violence across their entire network. The sexual slavery that followed trade punishments represented another economic dimension of Viking justice. Women who survived initial punishments were often sold to brothels that specifically catered to merchants, their presence serving as ongoing warnings about the consequences of deception. These women were marked with tattoos describing their crimes, turning their bodies into cautionary tales. Some were trained to identify fraudulent goods through forced consumption. Women who had sold spoiled food became taste testers. Those who had passed off inferior textiles were made to judge fabric quality through touch alone. Their expertise, gained through suffering, made them valuable while keeping them permanently enslaved to the commercial system they had tried to cheat. The psychological warfare Vikings waged against merchant families extended to sophisticated manipulation of maternal bonds. They discovered that forcing women to choose between their children's suffering and confessing to additional crimes produced more reliable intelligence than simple torture. A mother might endure any personal agony, but watching her child's finger broken for each lie she told proved unbearable. Vikings documented which age groups and relationships produced optimal compliance. Teenage daughters were most effective for breaking mothers' resistance, while small children were reserved for the most stubborn cases. This systematic exploitation of maternal love created decision trees that maximized information extraction while minimizing child mortality. The integration of Viking punishment practices into local folklore created lasting cultural impacts that persisted centuries after Norse traders vanished. European fairy tales about mysterious strangers who punished dishonest merchants echo Viking trade raid patterns. Stories of women transformed into monsters for lying preserve cultural memories of how trade fraud led to dehumanization. The archetypal figure of the honest merchant blessed with prosperity versus the cheater who loses everything reflects Viking-imposed commercial morality. These folktales served as informal education systems, teaching children about commercial ethics through stories that originated in historical trauma. The decline of Viking trade punishment systems didn't come from moral awakening, but from economic evolution that made extreme violence less profitable than regulated commerce. As European kingdoms centralized and established formal legal systems, the personal nature of Viking justice became incompatible with state monopolies on violence. But the transition wasn't smooth. Many merchant communities had internalized Viking methods so thoroughly that they continued informal punishments for decades after Norse influence waned. The Danish trading posts in England maintained fraud courts until the Norman conquest, where merchant wives accused of deception faced tribunals that blended Viking brutality with Anglo-Saxon law. These hybrid systems produced some of the most extensively documented cases of commercial punishment in medieval history. The Chronicle of Marjorie of York, tried in 1061 for selling diseased wool to Danish traders, shows how Viking punishment philosophy persisted even as methods moderated. Rather than immediate physical torture, Marjorie faced weeks of escalating commercial humiliation. She was forced to wear the rotting wool she had sold, the putrid fleeces attracting flies and causing skin diseases. Her merchant stall was relocated next to the city's waste pits, where she had to continue trading while surrounded by filth. Every sunrise, she had to publicly announce her crime and invite customers to examine her remaining goods for fraud. The psychological torture of maintaining business while being systematically degraded proved so effective that 3 other merchant wives confessed to similar crimes rather than face Marjorie's. Fate, the Hanseatic League's adoption and modification of Viking commercial justice, created the first international business standards enforced through collective punishment. When a merchant family in Lübeck was caught defrauding partners in Bergen, the League didn't just punish the perpetrators, they banned all Lübeck merchants from Norwegian trade for a season. This collective responsibility forced merchant communities to self-police with vigor that matched Viking brutality. Women who might have risked personal punishment thought twice when their deception could destroy their entire city's commercial prospects. The League's records showed dramatic decreases in trade fraud, proving that economic ostracism could be as effective as physical violence. The psychological studies conducted by medieval church scholars on women who survived. Viking-style trade punishments provide disturbing insights into trauma that predates modern psychology by centuries. Abbess Hildegard of Bingen documented cases of merchant wives who developed what she called market madness, inability to handle money, terror at the sight of scales, hysterical reactions to common trade goods. These women often sought sanctuary in convents, but their trauma manifested in unexpected ways. Some became obsessed with absolute honesty, confessing to sins they hadn't committed. Others developed elaborate rituals around commercial activities, blessing coins before touching them or requiring witnesses for even simple purchases. The genetic legacy of Viking trade punishments can be traced through medieval genealogies that tracked fraud, bloodlines for centuries. Families marked by Viking justice faced marriage restrictions, as honest merchant clans refused to risk contaminating their reputations through association with proven cheaters. This created endogamous communities of commercially tainted individuals who could only marry among themselves, perpetuating cycles of poverty and exclusion. DNA analysis of medieval cemetery remains shows distinct genetic clusters corresponding to these outcast merchant families. Biological evidence of how Viking punishment created hereditary commercial castes that persisted for generations. The artistic representations of Viking trade punishments in medieval manuscripts reveal how these events became embedded in cultural memory. Illuminated texts show intricate details of punishment methods, with particular attention paid to female victims. The artists, often monks who had witnessed or heard detailed accounts of these punishments, created visual records that served as both historical documentation and moral warnings. The Codex Mercatorius, housed in Uppsala, contains over 50 detailed illustrations of trade punishments, each annotated with the victim's name, crime, and fate. These images weren't hidden away but displayed in guild halls and trading posts as ongoing reminders of Viking justice. The evolution of merchant insurance systems directly responded to Viking punishment practices. Knowing that a single family member's deception could trigger catastrophic retribution, merchant houses developed complex systems of mutual guarantee and oversight. The Venetian colleganza contracts included specific clauses about family liability for trade fraud, with penalties designed to trigger before Viking-style justice became necessary. Women entering merchant families had to post bonds guaranteed by their birth families, creating financial incentives for maintaining honesty across kinship networks. These early insurance systems, born from terror of Viking retribution, evolved into modern commercial law principles of collective liability and due diligence. The medical texts that emerged from treating Viking punishment survivors created an underground literature of trauma treatment that church authorities alternately preserved and suppressed. Physicians developed techniques for treating systematic rape trauma, rehabilitating deliberately broken bodies, and addressing what they called merchants' fear, psychological conditions specific to trade-related torture. These medical advances came at horrible cost, learned from treating women whose bodies had been destroyed in precisely documented ways. The ethical contamination of medical knowledge, gained through treating torture victims, created debates that medieval scholars struggled to resolve. The transformation of Viking trade routes after the punishment era-ended revealed how thoroughly fear had maintained commercial networks. Many ports that had thrived under Viking protection collapsed when Norse traders no longer enforced brutal honesty. The power vacuum led to widespread fraud that made long-distance trade temporarily impossible in some regions. Contemporary chronicles described the ironic nostalgia some merchants felt for Viking justice. Brutal as it was, it had created predictable if terrible consequences for deception. The uncertainty of whether cheating would be punished proved worse for commerce than the certainty of extreme punishment. The lasting impact on women's participation in medieval commerce can't be understated. The specific targeting of merchant wives in Viking punishments created generational trauma around female commercial activity. Many merchant families began excluding women from trade operations entirely, viewing their participation as too risky. This gender-based commercial exclusion, justified by historical examples of Viking retribution against women, contributed to the gradual marginalization of female merchants throughout medieval Europe. The irony that Viking culture itself had recognized female commercial agency was lost as their punishment. Methods created justifications for excluding women from trade. As we reach the end of this horrific journey through Viking commercial justice, we must confront uncomfortable truths about how modern business ethics evolve from foundations of terror. Every time we trust a distant business partner, every international trade agreement, every commercial standard enforced through economic rather than physical punishment, all build upon systems Vikings established through brutality. They proved that commerce requires trust, and in the absence of formal institutions, that trust was maintained through fear. The women who suffered under Viking trade justice paid an unimaginable price for the commercial systems we now take for granted. Their bodies became the parchment on which international business law was first written. Their screams in medieval marketplaces echo in modern arbitration clauses. Their blood in Norse drainage systems preceded the ink on our contracts. We must remember them not to glorify their suffering, but to understand that our civilized commerce rests on foundations of calculated cruelty. The Vikings taught the medieval world that trust could be manufactured through terror, a lesson that shapes global trade to this day. In our sanitized business schools and boardrooms, we've forgotten that the first international merchants were warriors. The first commercial law was written in scars, and the first trade agreements were signed by women who learned that cheating Vikings wasn't just bad business. It was a death sentence delivered in installments, of agony that transformed human suffering into economic education.